Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hi, this is Richard Jacobs with Future Tech Podcast, and I have a pretty prestigious guest today, Dr. Stephen Long. He has so many accolades that it's really better to have him tell it and introduce himself. But Dr. Long, how are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. Would you give listeners just a brief sketch of your background, and then we'll talk about the major work that you're doing currently?
Sure. I trained in agriculture at the University of Reading, and then I studied for my PhD at the University of Leeds in Britain on environmental physiology of plants. I worked for a while in industry with Tate & Lyle in their research division, and then I moved on to the University of Essex in England as a faculty member. And a lot of the work I was doing there was really looking at plants which had very high photosynthetic efficiencies, i.e. they could convert sunlight energy into plant biomass efficiently, trying to understand how they did it, and also their ability to do it under stressful conditions, particularly low temperature, and then later on aspects of global change. I moved to the University of Illinois in 1999, which has always been a center for photosynthesis research, where I could really then focus on my particularly interest of how we might be able to make plants photosynthetically more efficient and how we might be able to use that in adapting plants to global change.
When you say make plants more photosynthetically efficient, how much more efficient have you seen is out there in the wild, and what would be the benefit of doing it? If it's probably obvious, but what would be the benefit?
Well, I guess if we look at what we've done with our major crop plants over the last 60 years, we've had quite remarkable increases in yield following the Green Revolution. But a lot of that's actually been done by using genetics to get more and more of the plant's biomass into the bit we care about. So the grain of rice, the seed of soybean, and so on. And that's been done very effectively, but we've now reached a point where we really can't get that much more in because, say with soybean, the seed is pretty well 60% of the whole plant when we harvest it. And we're still going to need some stems and pods to support those seeds. So the only alternative is to just make the plant bigger. And that's where photosynthesis comes in. And we know that photosynthesis hasn't been improved very much at all in crops, and it falls way short of its theoretical efficiency.
So, okay, instead of making the plant bigger, what have you done to plants to make them more photosynthetically efficient? But actually, my first question, which I didn't ask, is what kind of plants out there do you see are the superstars in terms of photosynthetic efficiency out there?
Well, the most productive plant in the natural world that we found, and this is work I did way back in around about 1990, when I was really interested in trying to hunt down, what is the most productive plant we can find in the world, that is terrestrial plant, was an Amazonian grass actually growing on the floodplains of the Amazon called Echinocloa. And that was working with a group from Brazil and another group from Germany. And we found this grass which produced over 100 tons of dry biomass per year, and was certainly very efficient at converting intercepted solar energy into biomass. Now, when I say very efficient, it's, of the solar energy it's converting, about 3% of that ends up in its biomass, which is quite a bit better than many of our crops.
Well, so 3% is much more than other crops.
Yes, but we've done a lot of theoretical analyses, and we think actually, in theory, we ought to be able to get up to about 9%.
Wow. And what's common plants, what is their photosynthetic efficiency on average, 1% or?
Yes, if we look across crops as a whole, it's about 1%.
It's so amazing how these small percentages make all the difference. Like of all the sunlight that hits the earth, I would guess we use, I don't know what the figure is, but much less than 1%. And it's amazing that, it's so amazing that plants, the average plant is only 1% efficient with photosynthesis, and 3 is a superstar, and you're trying to go to 9. And if you just hear those numbers blindly, you think, oh, they're low, but it's incredible,
Yes. Yes, that 1% feeds all of us.
Yeah, I just find that amazing. I just wanted to, reflect on that for a moment. So making a plant more photosynthetically efficient just means its yield goes up quite a bit.
Yes, that's correct.
Are there other factors? Growth rate, is that impacted of younger plants?
Yes.
Do they live longer? What are all the effects and side effects and benefits of increased photosynthetic output?
It varies from plant to plant, but yes, they grow faster basically. So you're getting more biomass formed, and then if you can put 60% of that into the seed, you then get, of course, more economic yield as well from them, or more usable yield from those crops.
Okay, very good. What are some of the most exciting uses that these plants would be put to use for? Now, you started to talk about them, but let's talk about them in a more commercial way. What would be, if you get this 9% or even 4 or 5%? Who's the first person that's going to come knocking that says, Dr. Long, I got to have this, and we're going to use it for X?
Well, ironically, I'd say that at present we're in a few years where commodity prices have been pretty low. So today there's not a huge demand for this. But if you take United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization projections of what we're going to need by 2050 and what we might be able to deliver, then this would appear to become very important, because UNFAO project that by 2050 we're going to need about 70% more primary foodstuffs. That means rice, soy, maize, wheat, etc. The reasons for that are the global population is growing, but even more important is the fact that the global population as a percentage is becoming far more urban. Urban diets tend to demand more calories because there tend to be more meat products, more dairy products consumed. You've then got to go through storage and sales and transport, which all tend to lead to wastage as well. And the group at Minnesota, headed by David Tillman, project it may be more like 100% more. So if we don't meet that demand by growing more on the land we're already using, that would then incentivize, if prices go up, that incentivizes destruction of more natural habitat to use more land to grow our food. So in the long term, we see that being able to do this is going to be very important. But so I don't think big biotech companies are going to be knocking down our door tomorrow, because today there's not a huge amount of money in doing this. But if we look at, if you like, public good and so on, being able to feed the world by 2050, then I believe this is going to be very important. And of course, if there is a growing gap between supply and demand, that is going to hit the poorest in the world most. We spend less than 10% of our income on food, but there are areas of the world where 60% of the family budget goes on food. If food prices double, then those communities are going to be really hit.
Yeah.
And that's where the Gates Foundation's concern comes in.
The Gates Foundation? The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation?
Yes.
Okay. What do you think the upper limit on photosynthesis is going to be? Do you have an idea or a guess? And
well, I said 9% conversion of visible energy into energy in the plant biomass. There are, though, ways in which we can actually raise that theoretical value. We might be able to modify plants so that they can use longer wavelengths of light. They more or less use the visible spectrum today, but we know, for example, of bacterial systems that can use some of the infrared radiation. in the longer term, it might be possible to engineer those into plants. But, as I said, 9% is theoretical today, and we're not getting close to that. I think we could at least double the photosynthetic efficiency of our crops. If we really worked at it, we could probably get genetics that would do that maybe over a 20-year time frame. And that's why really starting this now is important, because, from the point of view of a commercial venture, 2050 is a long way off. But from the point of view of, if you like, crop breeding cycles, 2050 is not so long off, because any invention we have today would not be available to farmers at scale for at least 20 years.
Wow. Why is that, though? How come we couldn't make it available sooner? Why is it so slow?
Well, anything we do with bioengineering has to go through a great amount of regulatory testing. Once that's done, you've then got to multiply up the material. You want to test it in a range of environments, and that takes quite a bit of time. And just multiplying the material out so that you can actually provide it to farmers takes quite a bit of time.
How far along is your research? Have you do you have plants in the lab that are at photosynthetic efficiencies of 4, 5, 6, or even 9%, or is it you don't know if you can get there yet?
No, we have in the work that's been sponsored by the Gates Foundation. We recently published some work where we're trying 7 different ways of improving photosynthetic efficiency, and so one of those we've now been able to validate with field tests is giving us about a 15 to 20% improvement on the present. So that may not sound a great deal, but a breeder would be really happy if they can get a 1% increase in productivity. So the 15 to 20% is a large jump. So we have a couple of others which are coming through, which we think may be of similar magnitude, and we think these are additive as well. So,
can you talk at all about the mechanism, or I don't know if it's proprietary or not, but how are you boosting the efficiency?
Yes, the one that we published quite recently was on the fact that when crop leaves are in full sunlight, they're receiving more light energy than they can use in photosynthesis. But the leaf absorbs that excess light energy. That excites the chlorophyll molecules. They go into excited energy state. If that energy is not dissipated, it will actually react with oxygen to produce what we call active oxygen. And that could actually bleach the leaf. So the plant has to get rid of that excess energy. And it does it by inducing a process which converts that excess energy to heat. And so the energy is just harmlessly lost as heat. But when the leaf goes into the shade, for example, a cloud crosses the sun, it will carry on dissipating a large chunk of the energy it's receiving as heat, even though now it could use all of that energy in photosynthesis. And it takes it many minutes to adjust to that drop in light level. And we modeled this, what that would mean at the level of a crop canopy. And what we learned from that modeling was, this could be costing us, depending on the crop, anything between 8 and 40% of potential daily carbon assimilation. So one of the things we've been doing in our project is genetically looking at ways we could speed up this relaxation. And so we identified 3 genes that if we upregulated them, we might speed this process up. And that's what we did. We upregulated those 3 genes. We found that in the greenhouse, these plants were growing faster and bigger, and they were relaxing this process faster as we predicted. And then we tested that in replicated field trials, and that gave us this 15 to 20% boost in dry matter productivity.
I don't know if this is just a quick side note. I know basic science, but I've heard that science doesn't even understand 100% how photosynthesis works. Is that true, or is that just an urban myth?
I guess it depends on what level of understanding you're really discussing. We know all of the steps in photosynthesis. We know, for example, how photosynthesis splits water to get reductive energy and release oxygen. I guess what we don't know is everything which is happening at that reaction center at very fine scale. But we know that certainly know the basics, or well beyond the basics, in a great deal of detail. And this was very important for us in coming into this project, because what it allowed us to do was simulate on the computer every step of photosynthesis, if you like, rather like a production line. And then we could say, well, if we're putting all these resources into these 160 steps, are we optimally allocating our resource, or could we do better? And that was really how we came up, if you like, in silico, of predictions of how we could improve photosynthesis. And then what we're doing in this Gates project is testing these out in practice.
Very interesting. Huh. I guess the crops that would be the best candidates are rice, maybe wheat. What are the top 2 or 3 that would help feed a lot more people if you can get them to be more efficient?
Well, for the Gates project, we're focusing on rice, which is the most important source of direct source of human calories on the globe. We're also looking at cowpea, which is black-eyed pea to us in the States. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it is the biggest source of vegetable protein. So it's a legume, so it fixes its own nitrogen. And we're also looking at cassava, which is one of the most important sources of carbohydrates, particularly for poorer farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. But we've certainly had industry interest in putting these into soybean, which we're testing out. The one I mentioned to you that we published on sort of relaxation as the leaf goes into the shade is being tested out in soybean, in maize, and a few other crops as well.
What about making our own, photosynthetic process, our own leaves, or our own, again, mimicry of photosynthesis? That's why I asked you how much is understood. Has anyone been able to do that? And
in terms of artificial leaves?
Yeah.
No, I mean, certainly some of it's been mimicked, but, this is 160 biological reactions, and just stabilizing proteins and so on is a very difficult task. So, I think that is a long, long way off. Obviously,
that's amazing.
Yeah. So,
it just amazes me, that plants and this process can be so complex. I just wanted to appreciate that for a moment. That's why I brought it up.
Yeah.
So, are there any negative effects you're seeing on the rice, when you upregulate these genes? Does it cause any problems that you have to counteract?
We've not seen any so far. So, I mean, clearly, if you put it in, if you do this, for example, in a crop like rice, you're making more carbohydrate, but you also need to provide more nitrogen as well for that grain too. The traits we've targeted in themselves do not require more nitrogen or very little more, but clearly if you're producing more grain, you don't want to reduce the protein content of that grain. So that may require more nitrogen. A number of the traits we're looking at do not require more water. So that will be a plus. We get more production without more water. But we haven't seen negative traits, but obviously we're on the lookout for those.
What about the nutritional profile of the rice? Do you think that'll be affected?
Well, we think that could be impacted. The best proxy we have for that is growing rice under elevated carbon dioxide levels artificially, because if you boost carbon dioxide, you boost photosynthesis and you get more productivity. And generally there you do see some decline in nitrogen content of the grain, although breeders think they could deal with that by selecting lines which just naturally produce higher protein in the grain. So it's probable that breeding will be able to offset that.
But you don't see any negative counterbalances, that the nutrition changes or becomes reduced.
Well, I think that would be an issue that would have to be addressed. That protein content would quite possibly go down, and that would need some breeding to counteract it. But we think that's doable. I mean, for example, in Illinois, we have lines of maize which have been selected over a 100-year period that have 4 times the protein content of other lines. So it appears that conventional breeding could address that issue.
Yeah. How do you get the upregulated genes to quote unquote take, so that when the rice, is bred, the subsequent generations don't have to have their genes upregulated? They just, that's just how they are. They're more photosynthetically efficient. How difficult a task is that?
We think that's quite a difficult task because there isn't a great deal of natural variation in photosynthesis. So in conventional breeding, where people have been selecting for more productive lines, they haven't selected for more photosynthesis and more photosynthetic capacity in the leaves. So, for example, the upregulation of genes in the example I gave you, we are looking at whether that could be achieved using CRISPR-Cas9 technology to see whether we could get the same result. What we did in our experiments was to add extra copies of those genes. But it's possible you could edit regulatory elements in front of the genes to get the same effect. And that's what we're starting to explore now.
Very interesting. What's your guess on how long, even with a 15 or 20% increase, how long do you think it'll take you to be able to breed this into rice where it's sustainable and you're able to select for this, and farmers are able to plant this upgraded rice?
Well, I think it would probably take about 10 years to, if you like, to get it into rice, to then be able to show that this, test that this works in a number of environments, maybe select the best genetic backgrounds for it to go into. But actually getting that, because this would be a genetically modified crop, getting that through regulations, getting it accepted, could take another 10 years, maybe longer. Golden rice has been there for a long time and is still not available to farmers because of regulatory concerns.
Right. That's terrible.
We are also looking at cowpea, and we're working with a group in Australia that has worked closely with countries in West Africa on transgenic cowpea. And so they're hoping with the Nigerian government to release an insect-resistant cowpea later this year. So we're hoping to work with these groups in Australia and Nigeria to maybe do the same thing with our upregulation of photosynthesis. So that may be a slightly shorter path to getting this to farmers.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, it's terrible that regulation could be the thing that slows this by many years. It's really vital, the research you're doing. It's amazing.
Probably the top thing we feel we'd be doing is making this technology available so that if food shortages do start to develop, society will have a choice as to whether it wants this technology or not. But if we don't, as I said to you at the beginning, if we don't start now, it could be too late. And,
yeah, definitely.
But I understand the concerns because I feel plant sciences handled genetic modification of crops poorly. It didn't really explain what it was to the public when it should have done, and that really allowed opposition groups to then move in and develop a lot of fear about new technology. And
yeah, true.
We do have ourselves to blame.
Well, I'm glad there's people like you that are working on this. It's vital, Just a couple more questions. I'm just curious about the plant superstars that you know of that are out there in the world. What evolutionary or environmental pressures do you think have caused them to be so much more photosynthetically efficient?
A lot of these plants seem to be growing in what we call conditions of primary colonization. So that, when, for example, on the Amazon floodplain, after there's literally an annual tide as the river rises through the year and then falls. And when it falls, it kind of leaves bare mud behind. And this echinoclea plant I mentioned to you will then grow up on that bare mud and be very productive. And I think it's an unstable environment where a plant has to be productive to get a foothold. We see the same with, for example, reed may be something people are familiar with, in the temperate world, which can move onto mudflats. Cordgrass is a very productive plant that grows on the mudflats on the coast. And there's also elephant grass, miscanthus, which is something which will invade sort of land after a volcanic eruption. It will invade the bare surfaces. This seems to be where we see the most productive plants. The other thing all of those have in common is they use a process called C4 photosynthesis, which we know to be the most efficient form of photosynthetic carbon metabolism.
Okay. Why not try to graft some of the genes from some of these superstars into rice as an alternative?
Well, that is exactly what a Gates Foundation project called C4 Rice, headed by Jane Langdale at the University of Oxford, is actually trying to do, is to convert rice into a C4 plant.
Okay. Well, this has been really fascinating. Maybe some people are not excited by plants and feeding people, but I think this, everything we talked about is really fascinating. And any last points that I haven't asked that you think will be really important to bring up before we finish?
Yeah, I suppose, you mentioned C4 rice, and we talked about the sort of relaxation of this photoprotection. Mm-hmm. A number of things we're looking at are actually additives. So those two, for example, could be put together. We've got other groups that are looking in the Gates project that I had. We've got groups that are looking at how we might be able to speed up metabolism, how we might be able to reduce losses in a process called photorespiration. And these things could be put together. And that, we think if we could put all these things together, we could as much as double the yields of our major crops. If you like, I know it's a term that's been used very often, but it could, be a second green revolution. And I think, we need that. I guess one other point I'd make is, other people have pointed out, well, FAO predict we need 70% more food production by 2050. But if, for example, our diets became more vegetarian, we wasted less food and so on, we might not need that much increase, which is true. But unfortunately, the trend is going the opposite way at present. But of course, the other thing, if we can get more out of each acre of land we're using, we would need less land. And agriculture is a major pressure on the landscape. So we're probably using some land for agriculture that would be better not used because it's easily eroded, and so on. So, I think whether we need 70% more by 2050 or not, these advances will be important to our future.
Last question, Dr. Long. So how can interested listeners read your published papers? Where are they? And, if they want to find out more about what you're doing and perhaps even get in contact with you for collaboration or other business activities, what's the best way to reach your organization and find out about your papers?
So we have a website, ripe.illinois.edu, where you can find out about our Gates Foundation project. Also, I have a lab website as well, which also lists all of the publications. And if you Google Long Lab, so LONGLAB at Illinois, you'll be able to find us that way as well.
Well, very good. Dr. Long, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. It's been a great interview. And, thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much for your interest in what we're doing.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.